the key is Alpha has built into it native connectors to databases, a whole host of different databases. And the intent of this is to remove the complexity for the developer from having to code a whole bunch of SQL and other things like that to get their job done. And you'll see that through our list controls and through our grids, that basically it turns a database SQL generation job into a point and click. And so most people are using things like Access or MySQL or Oracle or SQL Server. And what's really cool about it is that not only do we cover sort of the basic capabilities of these SQL databases, but you can actually extend it and leverage things such as stored procedures and triggers and things that are in the database that are available through our system. So the beauty of that is that you can leverage all the power of the database in a very simple and straightforward session. And this becomes very important for both when you're creating interactive user interfaces for people, but also when it comes down to doing things like reporting. Reporting is a critical component of anybody's work. And what we're finding is that sometimes it's much easier for the database to pre-compile data and then present it to our report editor to then display it to the user, thus making your report generation simpler from the standpoint of you have the database do some heavy lifting, and you could do it through a stored procedure or elsewhere. So I want to make sure people are understanding that Alpha has a complete suite of databases we support, and it's very, very powerful from there. But beyond that also, Alpha also has the ability to connect to both local but also web file storage systems. So when you're interacting and dealing with files, you can store those on the Alpha application server as, and using the file system on the server. But Alpha is taking the next step, and we actually include the capability to integrate into Amazon's S3 and also Azure Storage Services. And the really cool thing about this, and this is again part of the power of Alpha, is the fact that when you connect to these systems, once you set it up, the actual interaction with each of them goes through point-and-click interfaces. So even though they may have different quote-unquote dialects or APIs that you use, Alpha shields those APIs. And once you set those connections, and I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes, then you don't have to worry about all the APIs. Basically, it says, oh, you want to move this file here? Do it. And then all the internal XBasic capabilities, too, in terms of file and folder manipulation, are all handled by our system. So it's very, very powerful. And it's really an extension of our work with databases. Once we kind of understood how the database worked, it became a situation where we wanted to then also extend that simplicity and ease of use to the storage systems. And more with the increased size of photographs, the increased size of multimedia elements such as video, people are moving that data out of the database and onto the file system, whether it's local or through one of these third-party web systems. And you get that right balance in your system. So very, very powerful. And in fact, if you go back probably about a month, we did a great presentation on how to use the S3 Amazon Web Services. So if you're curious about this, please look up our previous Q&A webinars and you'll see that from there. But we're not stopping there. And that's really important, is that this was the next stage of sort of our, let's make the web simpler, especially the web API environment simpler. So Alpha has also created other supported web API implementations. One of the ones I use a lot personally, and I highly recommend you look into, is using the Mandrill SMTP system for email. Basically, it's a third-party SMTP system that allows you to, we allow you to connect to and send emails through that system. And the cool thing about it is that it's literally set up a variable, add 3 or 4 values, call it, and you're done. So it's child's play to create these integrations. And what's neat about these integrations is they're powerful enough to allow you to extend them to actually see what mails were delivered, if there were any bounce backs, things like that. Very easy to do that. And now coming up very soon, and I've given a quick preview of this to people before, but Alpha is adding to our, essentially our data storage series, OData support. And I'm not sure if people in the audience are familiar with OData, but OData is a standard web API that you can call, that people can implement and people can call to allow you to expose data from systems. So great examples of that are SharePoint. So instead of going through some kind of native API structure to connect to SharePoint, you can now use OData connect to it to make calls to SharePoint to retrieve data, insert data, query data, and it's all supported through this OData. And other major systems such as SAP, and which is a huge ERP system, has an OData interface. So it allows you to interface with these third-party large systems in a very simple manner. And what's great about this is that Alpha is using the same methodology to kind of roll that support so that it becomes a point-and-click exercise instead of having to do that. Another one is MongoDB. There's support for that for people who are doing what's called NoSQL, which is more modern and more getting very popular in terms of support of storing data. But also within Alpha is a whole set of functional capabilities in our XBasic language that allow you to support, to write your own connections into things like Twilio, Twitter, and Slack. And we're talking about 4 or 5 lines of code. And you could use Twilio to be sending out SMS messages. You could be actually sending out messages for Twitter or on Twitter or reading them. And Slack, which I'm not sure if people have heard also, is a really cool kind of, it's a business-oriented messaging system. And again, very, very simple to roll your own. And we also, with our Node.js, there's a huge amount of Node.js libraries. So what I wanted to get across before I got into the Q&A session was the fact that Alpha is an open system. We really try to encapsulate these complex things such as SQL databases, web file storage, disconnected operation, and now things like Mandrill and OData, so that you as a developer can focus on leveraging those sort of simple-to-use interfaces within Alpha to focus on producing the application instead of spending all your time focusing on writing code and figuring out how to do strange web APIs. And this is just the start. Alpha has a continual program that analyzes the very popular APIs out there and are working quickly and effectively to bring those into the system to reduce your amount of effort there. So I just want to give you a simpleware. I want to go over into the development system, and hopefully the system will be speedy enough that you'll be able to follow along. Dave, just kind of monitor it and let me know that people are coming through and seeing it.
Yep, I sure will.
What's that?
Yeah, I sure will. So far, it looks good. We are seeing your screen.
Okay, good. I wonder, you know, aside, I wonder if my USB port is starting to die, because it seems to be the audio portion that's doing it. So that said, I'm in the Alpha development system, which some people are familiar. If you're not, this is the Alpha development system. And through that, on the web project control panel, there is tools, and on the tools menu is where you access these different connections to these different systems. So if you're going to connect to a database system, you go to the tools menu and you select Alpha DAO connection string. And in here, you can then connect to different data systems. And you'll notice you're not just limited to one. You can have multiple data connections within your system, something going to Access, something going to Oracle, something going to SQL Server, QuickBooks. And when you create a new one, when you build that connection string, it basically gives you a list of different ones, and based on those lists, it asks you for little pieces of information. So for instance, if I'm doing Access, it's asking me where the file name is. If I'm doing MySQL, it's asking me where's the host of the server and then my login information for that. So it kind of tailors itself to get the information it needs to be able to connect to the system you want. But also really cool is you can connect to QuickBooks or QuickBooks Online, where on that system you can get what's called a connection key and a login key, which are private, and then you can put those in here, and now you can connect directly into the QuickBooks system by virtue of this system. It's so cool. And I mean, if anybody's ever tried to write a interface with QuickBooks, it's really a pain, and this simplifies it a lot. Now, if you're interested in connecting in and using the storage systems, again, you go to Tools, Storage Connection Strings. And again, you can have multiple connection strings. You can be storing data on Amazon, on Azure, on your local disk. It's up to you, and you can have them all at the same time. And when you go in here, you'll build a connection string, and you'll determine if it's Amazon or Azure, or if you can use disk, which is the disk space on the Alpha server. And when you select one of those, then it's going to ask you a subsequent set of questions, such as in the case of Amazon, they have different regions where your stuff is hosted. And then you have these access keys and secret keys that you get from Amazon to allow you to securely do there. And then they have these things, container names, which are like folders. And then you can test it and work it from in there. And what's really cool about that is, again, it takes care of all the complexity of understanding the API to talk to those systems. So now when you create a system, like if I'm going to create an upload for one of those, and I'm going to show you real quick and then we'll get to questions, is let's say I wanted to have I'm creating a UX, and a UX for people who are new is our form. Let's say I want to have a button, and that button is going to do upload file. Then I can go down here to the click event on that button, and then I can add an action JavaScript. And you'll notice right here, there's a file upload, say, for Amazon S3 built into it. There's a standard file upload that could work for both Azure and for the Alpha site. And then it's a matter of point and click to go ahead and set up that upload, telling it which connection string you want to go to. Then you can, like for instance, if I want to go to my Amazon S3, I can then say, do I want to allow multiple files? I can then add a whole bunch of other little pieces to say, before the file is sent, maybe do something after. But as you can see, we've taken these APIs from a coding standpoint and turned them into genies in a point-and-click fashion. So I highly encourage you to investigate this. This will make your applications extremely powerful. You can also get a lot of performance improvements because since you're offloading some of these capabilities to third-party servers, those servers are set up for high bandwidth, high availability, and you'll take a load off your file server where you're maybe running the Alpha file system there. So that was just a real quick, I want to kind of show everybody that, hey, Alpha has a very powerful set of connections for both databases, for web file storage systems, and these third-party ones, and we're increasing them and adding them at all times. And that is really powerful because it will save you a lot of time and energy of having to essentially code those yourself, and you can use your own, or you can use our kind of systems to interface with those. And again, we've just got it started. The neat thing about the web is that more and more of these APIs are becoming available. More and more people, for instance, are supporting OData. And when they support OData, then the beauty of that is that allows you to connect into many, many different systems using the same techniques and technology, so you don't have to recreate the wheel every time. So I'm going to go ahead and take a pause here, make sure we're coming through okay.
Yep.
Dave, do we have any questions? And again, just to remind everybody, please enter your questions into the GoToWebinar control panel. Allows us to best service you to find out what people are looking for information on, and we really want to support you.
All right, so we do have a question, which is when you're connecting to Access, what can you see other than just the tables?
Good point. Let me go ahead and show you. So let's say I am going to go ahead, I'm back into my web development environment, and just to remind everybody, I went ahead and Tools, Alpha DAO connection strings. I've already created a connection. So I went through the process of identifying, in this case, the Northwind MDB file on my drive. And there's a pointer to that. And so I've already identified that location there. So now what I can do is, let's say I want to create a grid component. So I'll go ahead and go back to my Web Project Control Panel. I'll create a new item. I want a web component. Oops. Oh, I hit the wrong thing here. New web component. And I would like a grid component. That's a great way to show this. Now, I have a whole bunch of templates for people who are new. What you can do is just select, say, read-only grid for SQL or updatable grid for SQL, etc. So let's go ahead and select that. Okay, gives you a little help there. And the first thing it's going to ask me now is, hey, what am I connecting to? Where am I going to get my data? So I'm going to click the select button here. I, again, have already pre-created my connection to my database. So I'm going to select connection, and I'm going to click OK. And now what it's done is, now that it knows where to go, it then gives me a selection of saying, okay, do you want to select a table or view? Do you want to make up your own SQL statement? Do you want to access a stored procedure? Now, obviously, a stored procedure doesn't make sense for Access, but for SQL Server or MySQL or Oracle, you could access that stored procedure. But for now, let's go ahead and select table or view. Now it's saying, okay, let's select that. And this is one of the real powers of the system. When I click select, instead of me writing a SQL statement, it gives me a view of everything in that database. So in this case, I have tables such as customers, employees, inventory, but I also have views. So pre-created views, let's say the 10 most expensive products, or product sales for 1995. So I can select either a table or a view in Access. If I were working on something like SQL Server, I could then actually access a stored procedure, pass it some parameters, and it would bring back the data appropriately. So I'm going to go ahead and select customers for now. Click OK. Then I can filter that data. I can order that data. It's very point and click. I can say, you know, I want the city to be equal to, and then put in the information there. Or if I want to order it and say, okay, I want to order it by, let's say, contact name in a descending fashion, it's all point and click from there. And the reality is, behind the scenes, it's actually generating SQL statements to pull that data in, but also what it's doing is generating the SQL statements to do inserts, updates, and deletes in the system, so you don't even have to write those. And then once you've selected those pieces, you'll notice now when I go to the fields, I have all my different fields, and I can just start adding and using them from there. And it's all the point and click kind of solution. So a bit long-winded, but I want to kind of give you the background that within Access, you're probably going to be seeing views and tables to access that. And then I often get this, just to kind of expand on that, as people say, well, I have some VBA code. What's really cool about VBA and Alpha is that you can actually, some of it's not going to be needed because often VBA is used for validation or other pieces there. Alpha has an enormous amount of built-in capability that you'll be able to use instead of having to write code to do so. But if you do have special functions, Alpha has a complete model in terms of the ability for you to take that VBA code, and there will be different syntax, but it's very similar in nature because they're both based on BASIC. But you can then recode that into Alpha and say, for instance, like when you're going to save a record, you wanted to make a call to make a call in the system to look up some data before it does that. That's all available, so you can migrate that code. And what I'm finding is that it's working out very well for people who are migrating from Access. Is A, they're able to pick up the language very quickly, and B, the languages in terms of how they interact with the databases are very similar. There's a few differences there, but they're very similar, and once you have the kind of way that Alpha works, it becomes very easy to put up the VBA code and recode it in Alpha in a very short period of time. And after you do a few of them, it goes from there. And that's what I see the challenge for people with Access is that tables, views, they're all good with, but then the concern is the amount of VBA they've created. What we usually do is we usually review the VBA, understand what VBA code is used for sort of user interface updates and validation, which can be done in a simpler fashion with Alpha. And then the other part, which is more, you know, hardcore calls into the database to do other things, those are the ones that usually need to be converted and the time spent on it. And it, you know, after a little while, it becomes kind of a point and click, turn the crank, and it works really well. So I hope that gives, it's a bit long-winded, but I hope that gives you a better feel of what you can access through the system. And again, it gets rid of all the writing SQL statements and other sequences there, where you can actually point and click and then access the data as you need it from there.
Excellent. So the next question is someone who says he's new to the Alpha architecture, and he's wondering, how would he access a database that resides behind a firewall and is only accessible from a server in the DMZ or directly with a VPN?
Interesting. That's a really good question. And the idea behind that is that the client does not, and I want to explain a little background. The structure of Alpha, and let me see if I have a picture of this. I wonder if I have it in my pictures. Yeah, ignore some of this, but the idea is, and I'll actually add this real quick so it makes a little sense. Let's see if I have a database picture here. You just go ahead and copy this over here. I'll just say database. Okay, and this will make sense in a moment. Okay, so to kind of give a feel for how this works is that when and I'm going to put one other shape here. Okay. So when you're developing an alpha solution, the app server is the key. That is what's helping manage the relationship between the functionality that's going on out in the outside world, and in this case in a web browser, or this could be a mobile device. So again, and kind of ignore this stuff. This was for a more detailed. But just think of it, your web browser and your mobile devices are out in the wild. Either they may be inside the firewall or outside the firewall. And then the app server usually is inside the firewall, but with an open port. That open port is like IIS and port 80. You just assign that port. And then therefore what happens is that the database is not being accessed directly from the thing in the field. The database is being accessed through the app server. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, and you have different ways you can set this up. But first and foremost, what will happen is the web browser out in the field will make a call to the app server. Now, obviously, the web browser needs to have a secure connection to the app server. And so often people make that a SSL. Alpha can be a full SSL compliant server so that you can use SSL to get a secure connection between things out in the field and the app server there. So this web browser here is either operating within the firewall, so therefore it's just going to call a server that's inside the firewall. You have nice security protection there. If it's outside of the firewall, it's going to go through a particular port to get to the app server. And then what's nice about that is then you can apply all your standard security policies to be watching traffic on that port to make sure only individuals can do it. And built into the app server is a full set of security. So even if the web browser can connect to that app server, they're still going to need to have the correct login credentials to be able to actually access anything behind the app server. And then the app server is going to grab the data from the database and then return that information back to the web browser through a very controlled fashion. Now, one method to do it is that if you have a VPN, then this kind of connection between the web browser and the app server goes through a VPN. So therefore, the app server doesn't actually have a port that's exposed to the outside world. It's only internal, and therefore you can use your VPN to allow either mobile devices that have connected through VPN or a web browser that's connected through VPN access to that app server. So that's level one. If you do want to be able to have people with web browsers, you can just open that port. Now, there's another alternative too, and this is for people who are in the more Microsoft-oriented shops. So we have now a support for IIS. So for people who are using IIS, that's the information server from Microsoft. What actually happens is that the web browser connects to IIS, and then our app server is a plugin for IIS. And so the real cool thing about that is then you get the full power of managing that app server from within the IIS environment, including security, policy setting, URL setting, and also the ability for IIS to manage who can access that part of the component. And for shops that are using IIS, this tends to be a very popular solution because their security policies, their security people have already set everything up and very comfortable with IIS, so they can merely just plug Alpha into it, and then we work through IIS. And the app server also can access information in IIS, say, for instance, Active Directory, for security policy enforcement and for data collection, etc. So kind of long-winded, but Dave, the intent is that you can either set it up like a VPN, so this web browser kind of lives inside this VPN and this app server is living inside your firewall environment. If you have a situation where you need to have people who are outside the firewall, then what you can do is you open the port on the app server and on your firewall so that traffic streams through that single port that you can police and set policies on, and then you further use the app server's web security framework to be able to then further limit it. Even if they can get to that port, the server will not do anything for them unless they can then access, then they can get their credentials from the app server. So you have sort of, what's great, it's like an old castle. You have a set of pikes, then you have a moat, then you have a tall wall, and then you have boiling oil that is inside there. So you have these multiple layers you can set up to prevent people from maliciously accessing your data. Or and beyond not even malicious, is that if certain people within your organization are only allowed to see certain pieces of information, again, you can set up the app server accordingly to say, okay, everybody can access within our company can access this app server, but only these individuals can access this information in the database because of certain security policies that you set up. So it's very flexible, very easy to set up, very easy to manage over time. And I think as you get into it, we did a webinar about a month and a half, 2 months ago where I went through and showed how I set up security. That's a good one to watch just to get the feel for how you set up security and do those pieces from there. So I hope that gives you a little bit more information. If you have a follow-up question, just get it back to me, and we can go into more detail. Or remember, you can send emails to guides, Guides, at alphasoftware.com, and we take those very seriously, and we will get that to the person who needs to get it in terms of helping you, or get you the answer directly.
That's right. Just one other point. We're seeing more and more people are, especially bigger enterprises, are saying, hey, absolutely no way. You can build your alpha application, but you're not allowed to connect directly to the database. We don't want you to even make a SQL Server connection to those tables. Instead, what they would do is the IT department would build out some web services that would allow you to query the data and enter in record, and they have much more control over the web services than simply giving you a connection string into a database. And we work with web services as well, so it's really the whole gamut of security there. And the last thing I'd like to say is that if you do open a port to your database that the app server connects to, the app server is only going to ever be connecting through one IP address, so the firewall can restrict access only to the Alpha Anywhere server. So so that reduces any sort of danger of anyone else getting in. They need to have actual physical access to your network.
Just also, if I can expand on that, one other thing I wanted to let everybody know is that what's a really cool trend is that two-phase authentication. The idea of where you say, okay, I want to log in, and say the first time it says, okay, I'm going to text you a code because I know you're the only one who has that phone and can see that code, and then you have to enter the code. And even though that's not built into the Alpha system, we support that through our web API capability. So in fact, I've seen one account that used Twilio, which now has a two-phase, it's called two-phase authentication, where basically what happens is the person says, okay, I want to log in, so they use their login ID information that have been provided to them. So that's the first thing it does. And then the app server says, okay, hold on, I'm putting you in kind of timeout or purgatory until I get my second thing. And so what will happen is behind the scenes, the app server will call, in this case, Twilio, or even directly SMS you a randomly generated code. So you could write your own, but there's nice features on other ones. And then that person will get a text or an email that includes that authorization code. Then they enter that into the system, and then the system says, okay, this person's okay. I've given them the rights so they can go ahead and log in. Next time they log in, they don't need that second code. But this gives you an extra level of security to make sure someone's not spoofing your system. So there's a lot of really cool stuff. You can either roll your own inside the app server, or, which is really cool, you can use some of these third-party services where they'll even call you and voice you the code that you have to enter in your system. So you even get away from text messages that could be spoofed and things along those lines. So really, really neat stuff. And what's great is we can tap into the greater ecosystem, the greater security ecosystem that's being built on the web to kind of help increase security for all these systems.
Excellent. Another question, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but does Alpha Anywhere support smart card authentication?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I think there's methods to support it. I don't think there's like a native capability that's been built for any specific smart card company. But definitely, if you could provide us who that card manufacturer is and how that works, we might be able to provide you a little bit more data. But off the top of my head, I don't know of anybody specific. But obviously, much with the way the APIs, I'm sure there's a way to support that smart card capability within our Alpha app server.
Excellent. So just if you want to write in and say which smart card technology you are using, we'll be able to look it up.
We can try and do a little information. That's what we're here for.
Find it out. Yep. It looks like we're coming to the end of questions. So if we're, let's see if we've got another one. So they're going to use CAC cards for smart card authentication. Let's go check. We'll check.
I'll do
We'll
a
check
little
that out for
look
last
into
time.
that.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely. We'll get back to you, and we'll bring them up in the next webinar.
Well, I'm excited about too is like more and more as people are using mobile platforms. Alpha or Apple has their Touch ID, and they're starting to open up that more and more for people to use as an authentication method. So you literally can use your thumbprint on there. But also, I see Samsung is introducing more improved thumbprint authentication. So really neat stuff going on in that area, and between two-phase authentication and the biometric authentication, we're given the opportunity to make our applications more and more secure and more reliable to larger enterprises who are picking up the technology very quickly. So excellent questions, and we really appreciate that. In fact, we'll go from there. So.
Great. I'm not seeing any more questions right now, so we can end early, or you guys can send us some questions. I'll give you guys a minute or two.
It's up to you.
Yeah. We're willing to go home.
Don't make us hang up.
We're willing
to
go home.
Don't make us hang up. We will, but don't make us.
Yeah, exactly.
No, we really appreciate everybody taking the time to spend with us.
Yeah.
The intent of this is just kind of open the doors for what we can do with Alpha, help guide you towards what it is, answer those burning questions. And, the interesting thing and the challenge is that Alpha is a moving target, meaning that I like to call them the Oompa Loompas, which don't tell them that. So don't give this, developers don't give them this webinar. I'll never talk to them again. But the Oompa Loompas are back at the Alpha factory working on all these really cool capabilities, and they just keep coming out all the time. And it's somewhat of a challenge to stay on top of it. But the cool thing about it is that it continues to expand in making life easier to create more and more complex and complete applications with Alpha. So what's great, though, is we do record all these kind of questions and information. We provide that back to our development team because it's also a different measure of what is hot out in the market, meaning what are those key things that people are concerned with, they want to use, they want to do. And so your input is very valuable. And we always want to say thank you for taking the time to spend with us on these webinars, and we treat it very seriously.
Excellent. We do have a question about when the IIS plugin will be released. It will be released very, very shortly. It is being used in production by some people even today. If you need more information, just send an email to guides, GUIDES, at alphasoftware.com, and I will get in touch with the person who is heading that initiative over here at Alpha. So, but for all intents and purposes, it is running. I don't know if it's been officially released, but it's available right now. And that looks like it. Oh, hang on. Can you connect directly to SQL Server without going through the application server? Is a question we have.
The answer is yes. If you so choose, there's no reason why you couldn't. Now, that said, you would. There's no inherent direct connect capability within our grids and our components. But, and this is very powerful, there is that, let's say I'm back into my development environment, so bear with me. Let's say I create and want to add a list control, which is the primary control for mobile, where you've seen demos of it before. And one of the most powerful capabilities with the list control is that, A, we support native SQL right out of the gate. So if you want to connect to the SQL backend, you're good to go. In fact, you can connect to DBF. You could also connect it to static data. You could connect it, again, as coming out soon, to OData, which actually, a great example is I think SQL Server supports OData, and therefore you can connect directly to it. You'll notice that there's a comment right here. But one other powerful capability is called custom, where you can write your own XBasic function or JavaScript function to call and retrieve data. So I'm not really sure of an off-the-shelf way you can write a Java command to connect to SQL Server. I don't need to do that since the tool handles all that for me. But there's no reason why you couldn't connect and use, say, a JavaScript action that can make a call to the server, authenticate, and then get the data out of the database. And then once it's handled there, once you have that data, then the rest of it operates the same in terms of laying out your columns and doing the presentation layer and everything else associated with it. So I'd say the best angle if you wanted to connect directly to the SQL Server would be either through a web API that's running on top of that SQL Server, which is probably the simplest from a standpoint of doing something like that, or if there's a JavaScript library that maybe allows you to connect to SQL Server and do that, maybe you can leverage that. Because what's cool about Alpha is that when we're in our properties here for a UX, and over here is where I'm accessing that, and let me go JavaScript linked files. We have this thing called the JavaScript linked files, and in here I can link in any kind of JavaScript library I'd like to use within my system, and the system will encapsulate that when it provides it to the mobile device, either through the web browser or done through PhoneGap. And in fact, that's what I was mentioning earlier. Is one thing that was really cool is I was able to leverage a third-party JavaScript library for date manipulation, which can get very complicated. And I found this really cool library that allows me to do some very sophisticated date manipulation on the client with no calls to the server. What I did is I linked that library right in here, and then within my controls, I was able to access that library. So if there's a library out there that allows you to access SQL Server directly, there's no reason why you couldn't, A, create a function to do that, a JavaScript function to do that, but you'll have a little bit more work on your side. You know, if it's native SQL, Alpha does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. With something like that, you're just going to have to roll your own, but there's nothing to say you cannot do that.
Excellent. So here I've got a really good question from someone who's also new to Alpha Anywhere. And they want to develop an application for data capture, where the data that's captured will be, in other words, which fields and which screens will be dependent on a contract type. So let's say they've got two types of contracts. Contract type 1 has 8 fields, and contract type 2, say, has 10 fields for data capture. So the first screen would just ask the person what for a contract number, and then from there, looks like after they confirm some details, which one of those details might be what type of contract is this, they would be steered to fill in fields based on what type of contract they said they were going to do, whether the 8 or the 10 field one.
Great question. So I'm going to create a simplistic version of this. So I've gone, well, just to get, make sure we meet our time here, I went ahead and got it started. But I went into my system. I had a UX control, which is our form builder. I went over here to panels, and panels are basically how we show and hide, or how we present information to the user. So the first thing I did was I created what's called a panel navigator, which is the panel navigator is, like think of it as a traffic cop. And then I created 3 panels, panel card number 1, number 2, and number 3. And I'm going to go ahead and change these names because often it makes it easier to maintain when you do that. So panel card number 2, I'm going to put in here contract A, and then here I'm going to put in contract B. Okay. So I've got so in here, I'm going to go ahead and put some information in here. Let's go ahead and do this. QA, QB, QC, QD. So those are like, let's say those are the questions for contract A. The information needs to be filled out there. And then I'm going to go over here in the text box. I'm going to go ZA, ZB, CC, ZB. Now, these would obviously, we would use probably populate lists from a table and grab this data directly back from the table. But for this demo, I just wanted to put in some right there. So I've got my questions in panel card number 1, or contract A, for contract A questions, and panel card in contract B. So I'll go into panel card home. I'm going to go to other controls, and I'm going to create a button here. And I'm going to create 2 buttons. And I'm going to say contract A and contract B. Okay. And so let's say they're going to work on contract A. What I can do is I can create a action item, panel. So I can say set act panel to be contract A. Okay, so they go into that, and then I can say, add another action here, panel, set active panel to be panel card B. Okay, so this is one method. I'm going to show you one other method really quick, which is also very powerful there. So now if I'm in my working preview, and I say contract A, you'll notice it's taking me, and it's probably, let me go ahead and open this up in a bigger window so everybody can see. Bear with me. Okay, so you'll see in here, I've got contract A, we're seeing my contract A messages. If I click contract B, then I'm seeing my B data entry field. So that's a way to do that. Now what's cool is that I'm using these buttons, but there's no reason to say why this couldn't be programmatically. So what I could do is when this whole form loads up, I could maybe look at the user and say, oh, they're on contract A, and just immediately show them panel card contract A. Or if I know they're on contract B. Or if they've filled out a questionnaire, then depending on that initial questionnaire, I can say, oh, they're on contract A from there. Now, I've done this with panel cards, but there's another method to do it. And I'd like to go ahead and show you that method. I hope this makes sense here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new item. And I'm going to show you a cool feature that makes the life a little easier as you get into this thing. Okay? So I've created this in here. So I'm back to my blank one there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a drop-down box. And I'm going to call this contract type. Okay. So in a moment, I'll set this here. I'm going to set my choices to be contract A, and that's A, and contract B, and B. And what this means is this is what's going to be shown to the user, contract A, and this is the value that's set below the surface for me from a programmatic level. And again, this could be dynamically come from a database. So you notice now when I do that, now I have this contract type, and I'll blow it up in a moment. But now what I want to do is based on that contract type, which this either could be set by the person manually selecting it or not, I'm going to create two containers. And containers are much like, they're very similar to panels, but I'll go ahead and do this, container there. Okay, so I've got my two containers for my two sets of questions. So I'm going to go back to my form right here. I'm going to go ahead and select these items. To save time, I'm going to go here and I'm going to select my questions here, and I'm going to copy those to the clipboard. Okay, now I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to paste those controls in the clipboard. And I like to show this to people to show how, wow, you don't have to recreate the wheel every time you're creating an interface. You can leverage stuff that you've already created and simply copy it from there. So copy that. And I'll go back here and paste it in here. Okay, so now notice what happens now. So I'll go ahead and paste that. Okay, so we'll show you what it looks like in the user interface. Now this isn't what you want yet. So where did this show? Wait, didn't it show there? Wait a second here. Go back in here. Okay. Okay, so we've got container there. Let me go ahead and save that. Working preview. Okay, something just glitched there. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you this in a full preview. I didn't save it, I guess. Let me see there. Yeah, okay. Now notice everything's being shown on the field at one time. And it doesn't matter which contract I've selected. It's showing on the field at the same time. So let's make a change. We go back into the system. And remember, we have this drop-down box. And our choices are contract A or B. And this is going to be equal to A or B depending on what they select. So now what I can do is I go to this container. And you'll notice over here, very important, is something that says client-side properties show and hide expression. So what I can do is set dynamic show and hide expressions on these containers. And so what I want to do is I want to say if the field contract type is equal to A. Okay? So now what I've said is that if this field contract type is equal to A, show container 1. And for container 2, I want to do the same thing, but I want to say if contract type is equal to B, show container 2. So now when I go, and I'll go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead and open this up, and if it all works great, the gods of demos are with us. Okay, you'll notice you're not seeing anything here because both of those values, this is set to nothing. But now watch what happens when I say contract A. Voila! It took that container and showed everything inside that container. Contract B, it's showing everything inside contract B. And so the cool thing about that is that as you go through and build this, by answering certain questions, then it's going to actually show and hide the other fields that you need to. And there's no reason to be said that when you launch this window, it may already have set this to be defaulted to be contract A, and then you can set that or contract B. So the cool thing about Alpha is that you can do it multiple ways. One way is I showed panels, and you could use the same technique showing show panel contract A if the item is a contract A type or B, or you can use this container capability if you're on the same form. But both methods work equally well. You know, the panel is kind of nice because if you're on a mobile phone, you see it where it actually shifts over to that set of questions, so you see interactivity. Here it's kind of an instantaneous kind of structure where based on what questions you've asked, it shows the items that you want.
All right.
So I hope that gives you some leads on how to do it, and we'll hold it there.
It does, but we do have a quick question, though, before you go any further. With your example, it's actually a pretty straightforward one, which is it looked like there was an extra blank line when you went to container B.
Aha.
What's that about?
There's a little trick.
Okay.
What these are, just to let everybody know, is these are just divs, D-I-V. So when Alpha takes this and turns it into HTML, it creates their div. There's a really cool little feature in this container where, and when I did that, it basically reserved a space for container 1 and container 2. That's why you saw that little behavior. But if you go over here, you see something here called prevent container float. And if I go ahead and move this up, it kind of tells you about this. Bottom line is that if you click that on both of these containers, and again, if everything works properly, let me go ahead and preview this for you. There's contract A, contract B. You'll notice it got rid of that little bit of...
Actually, I didn't notice because the screen has stopped painting, but if you could try that again.
Oh.
Okay, I see an A. I see a B.
Okay.
We might just be a little bit
now
behind.
We're blank.
Okay.
Contract A.
Yep.
Now contract B.
All right.
Voila.
It's not that I didn't believe you. It's not that I didn't believe you, Dion.
No. I kind of I was trying to wrap it up. So, but
thanks, man.
It's over here. It's called prevent container float, and it's a checkbox, and you do that on the container, and again, the container will properly behave in that scenario.
Excellent.
Good.
One last. We only have 3 minutes. One last question, because we get this one a lot, is how do you auto start the application server when the computer reboots? It happens to be running Windows Server 2012, but I think your advice will probably apply to most operating systems, most Windows operating systems.
Yeah, what you want to do is you want to run Alpha as a process on that server, and
as a service, yes.
As a service, yes. Excuse me, as a service, and therefore then it will auto reboot and auto load. What we see, and I do a lot of work with ZebraHost, who is an outstanding hosting environment for Alpha. They really understand Alpha. They use a product called Always Up. It's if you search it on the net for Always Up, and basically it's a tool that will let you set up these services, and it makes it easy, kind of a point and click. There's many third-party there's third-party tools that you can load that will set Alpha up as a service on the server. But the cool thing about that is then the server will watch, and if that service dies, it will restart it and make sure that or like when the machine boots. So either look at natively setting up services or check out the product Always Up. I use it. It's really simple. It turns it into a point and click, and then you can set policies too, saying if after so many, send me an email if this keeps happening or stuff like that. So you get some cool features that are available from that.
Excellent. So Always Up, I think, goes for around $50 or something. It's not terribly expensive, but it's definitely the one that everybody seems to be using when it comes to keeping the Alpha Anywhere server up. It's not the only way to do it. If you did a search in our Wikipedia for how to for server as a service, I created a document there a few years ago, but really for not much money. This will save you a lot of time. It does other things too. It gives you notifications and things like that if it wasn't able to bring the service up for some reason.
Yeah.
And we highly recommend it. So.
And just FY too is that you can use also services like Monitor US or New Relic to keep an eye on your service and then ping you when something goes wrong.
Yep.
So there's some, what's nice is Alpha is a very good server resident. So if you can do anything in terms of monitoring that server, you can monitor what's going on with Alpha.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of our time. Very sorry about the glitch at the beginning of it. Should be all set for next time. Anyway, thank you everyone who attended. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you again, Dion, for presenting today. We will have a recording of this up at videos.alphasoftware.com probably within about 2 days, but certainly over the weekend. Again, if you want to get there, it's a little convoluted right now, but you go to videos.alphasoftware.com, you go down to the button which says Documentation Library, and then when our video search box pops up, just type in webinars, and we've got all our webinars there. We're actually in the process of redoing our video library to make it even easier to find webinars. It'll have its own special section, but for now, that's how you get it.
It's great. It's our nod to Netflix. You can now binge watch all the webinars. It's great. You can say, guess what? This weekend, I'm just going to binge watch Q&A webinars.
Exactly.
And
right.
Plow through the whole season.
Right. Forget
right
Mad Men. Forget House of Cards. It's just going to be Alpha anywhere. All Memorial Day weekend.
Exactly. You got a 3-day weekend. You can get through everything.
That's perfect. Well, thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you at a future webinar. Take care and goodbye.
Bye now.